Pleasant welcome to one and all to Sporty's iPad Proficiency Check webinar. My name is Eric Radke, your facilitator for this evening. A big thank you first and foremost to Sporty's Pilot Shop, who's sponsoring tonight's presentation that we're happy to bring to you. And certainly we applaud you being on tonight for your ongoing iPad proficiency. The iPad, of course, as an EFB, has become standard equipment for pretty much everyone on the presentation tonight and for most pilots. So just like flying instrument approaches or practice and landings, it demands and requires is kind of best practice to maintain your proficiency, because there are always new features and techniques and best practices to learn, and this is certainly the start of that being on tonight. We are delighted to have with us as our content expert tonight, our presenter, Mr. Bret Koebbe from Sporty's. Bret is a vice president and senior flight instructor on our educational team, Sporty's Academy. He also serves as editor of Sporty's iPad Pilot News. If you are not a subscriber, you absolutely should be in terms of your ongoing iPad proficiency. It's absolutely free. iPadPilotNews.com. You can do that right now or immediately after the presentation and get yourself subscribed if you're not already a subscriber. And with that, Bret, take it away.
Thanks, Eric. Quick overview of what we're going to cover this evening, and this really is a fast-paced presentation. Really have about 78 slides here. I try to do a lot of visuals, a lot of key takeaways. So this is geared towards the beginner, but also if you've been flying with an iPad, we have a lot of advanced tips as well. Again, this proficiency type topics, things that have changed from year to year, whether it is procedures and how you use it in the cockpit, ForeFlight, Garmin Pilot updates that are really great that may have slipped through. And then also we're going to talk about lessons learned from professional aviation. We're using this mainly in general aviation cockpits, and that's the focus this evening. But there's a lot of things we can learn from professionals, whether it's the pilots flying corporate aviation or the airlines and how they use the product, that makes it both a very reliable product and provides all the timely information that allows us to leave behind the paper charts and the traditional reference materials in the cockpit. One trend we're going to cover is the concept I like to call the Digital Copilot, where the iPad is really starting to get smarter in terms of the software, and it can think ahead for you and make sure that all your bases are covered, both in the pre-flight section and in the cockpit itself during the flight. So we're going to cover some tips there of how the iPad can protect you and kind of keep you aware of what's going on, even when you may have a lot of workload going on. And then we're going to wrap up with some data link weather topics. That really is one of the most popular things in terms of the iPad today, being able to receive ADS-B weather and SiriusXM in the cockpit on a portable tablet like the iPad works out really well. So before getting started into the meat of the content, I want to bring up again this website, which is iPadPilotNews.com. I serve as editor of the website. We put out probably 2 to 3 articles per week. Every single thing this evening that we're going to cover in this presentation has an article written at some point, probably in the last couple of years, on iPad Pilot News. So again, this is a fast-paced presentation. If you see something, a topic, jot the notes down on it, go onto the iPad Pilot News website and do a search for that. And you'll probably find 1, maybe 2 articles on that topic. Something we're going to do this evening also, we'll follow up at the end of the presentation, probably tomorrow, with links to articles on the topics covered here as well. So if you maybe forgot something or saw a topic you want to learn more about, we'll send that out in an email format tomorrow. So let's start out by taking a look at the current iPad models available for pilots. And this can get kind of confusing because there's a wide range of models that look very similar that have subtle differences, but you do want to consider some various features and options and pricing when looking at these models. So let's start on the far left. You have the iPad Pro. That's available in both 11-inch and 12.9-inch models. These are the top of the line products that feature the edge-to-edge screen on the devices. These start at $799, so a little bit steeper price point, but they do have the most feature-rich, feature-capable options available in the iPad lineup. The next model is the iPad Air. The iPad Air name can be confusing because there was iPad Airs released 2 to 3 years ago. This is the new iPad Air, if you want to call it that, 10.5-inch. It is really a replacement for the original iPad Pro. Many pilots probably purchased the iPad Pro 10.5-inch. This is the exact same form factor with the upgraded A12 processor from Apple. So very high performance product, but at a really nice price point too. Starts at $499 for 64 gigabytes. So it's really there in the sweet spot of iPad models available. Next on the list is the iPad 10.2-inch model. This product was just announced about a month ago. It's the replacement for the entry-level iPad, and as the 10.2-inch represents the screen size diagonal, you may recall that the previous iPad was 9.7-inch. So this adds a little bit of more screen real estate to the iPad at that entry-level price point of $329, available in either a 32 or a 128 gigabyte size. And then lastly is the iPad mini. This is the latest generation iPad mini 5 with a Retina display. Starts out at a great price point again of $399. This also has that powerful A12 processor, so a really powerful product in a very small form factor. And talking to most pilots, the iPad mini is really the preferred size across the board when considering how it fits in the cockpit. And as I made a note here, consider 64 gigabyte as the minimum size for aviation use. So that means if you're looking at the 32 gigabyte model for either the iPad 10.2 or iPad mini, I would recommend upgrading to that extra storage capacity to be able to store all your aviation charts and other aviation data and your own videos or magazines, books, whatever it might be. Just gives you lots of flexibility long term with the product. I don't have information on it here, but a common question we get to is, do you want to add the cellular connectivity to the iPad, which is an extra $130 option typically? The benefit there is it's going to give you the AT&T, Verizon, etc. cell service, but those models with the cellular data also include GPS. So that is popular for pilots who want to fly with just the iPad with a built-in GPS and not rely on a third-party accessory. Now, as we'll talk about later, the ADS-B receivers that are very popular and a lot of pilots fly with, those have GPS built into it. So you kind of have double GPS at that point. So if you're looking to save a little bit of money and use an ADS-B receiver or maybe the GPS from your panel, if you're using a connected cockpit system, I would just get the base level Wi-Fi only model of any of these products and use GPS from that source. Now here's a quick look at the iPad mini 5 in the cockpit. This is a 172, and you can see how well it fits in there. It's tucked in the side there with a suction cup RAM mount. But again, this has the modern A12 processor, so it's a very, very fast, high-performance product. Another feature that gets commonly overlooked on the iPad mini is the anti-reflective screen coating. Apple puts this on the iPad Pro as well as the iPad Air, so more of the premium feature on the higher end models, but does make it very sunlight readable in the cockpit. Not perfect, not like a Kindle, but does eliminate a lot of that glare without having to install a screen filter on top of that. It has a traditional Touch ID button, so it does have the home button. Also supports the Apple Pencil, and best of all, if you're upgrading from a previous iPad mini model, it has the same footprint, so you can continue to use your existing RAM mount, kneeboard, etc., and make a nice clean upgrade to the new iPad mini. Here's a shot I took in a 172. Shows the iPad Pro on the far left, that's the iPad Pro 11, and the iPad mini on the right. Kind of shows the size context, and it really makes the iPad Pro 11 look bigger than it really is. I don't want to make it seem that that's enormous, because it actually is a really nice fit in most GA cockpits. But again, shows the relative size of the mini, still with that high resolution, detailed screen. And this screenshot here also does a good job of showing the anti-reflective screen coating. So you can see you have some direct light hitting the top half of both screens, but you can still read all the details just fine. And here's the lineup again of the kind of the middle size, full size iPads. So the iPad Pro 11 on the left, the iPad Air, which is the 10.5-inch screen in the middle, and then that 10.2-inch iPad on the right-hand side. So kind of best on the left, better in the middle, and then the good version on the right. Okay, let's transition now into kind of our main topic here, which is what we can learn from professional aviation. So think back to 2010 when the iPad first came out. And we as general aviation pilots were really the first ones to adopt the iPad. Around that time, we had Kindles, we had some off-market tablets, really non-brand name tablets that were showing up in aviation, but they weren't really stable, they weren't reliable. So when the iPad came out in 2010, it was a $500 product. It had a big color screen, had reliable software. Compare that to the Windows tablets at the time. And we also had software developers out there developing really intelligent and powerful aviation applications for the iPad. So it really became a hit. And as GA pilots, we didn't have any FAA regulations to deal with in terms of approvals. So we could go buy an iPad, install an application like ForeFlight or WingX at the time, and go flying with it. We could leave our paper charts at home. Now, the airlines and the professional aviation saw this obviously as an opportunity, but they have to go through approval processes and a lot more government regulation and approvals to get the product into the cockpit. So they were probably about 3 to 4 years behind actually using it and integrating it into normal operations. Now, a couple quick things again from a proficiency standpoint, or for those new to the iPad, there's a couple advisory circulars to pay attention to. And this is what governs and kind of deals with the legalities of using an iPad or even your iPhone or an Android tablet in the cockpit. And the first one you want to pay attention to as far as GA pilots go, and that's what we're covering this evening, is Advisory Circular 91-78. And as the Part 91 there specifies, it applies to the Part 91 operations, general aviation. I have a note here also, Advisory Circular 120-76D. That's the AC that applies to 121 and 135 commercial operations. And I bring it up because I want to say it does not apply to us. You're going to see a lot more strict requirements in there in terms of decompression testing and backups and FAA approvals. Again, that doesn't apply to us, but be aware that is out there for those operations. So AC 91-78, it's about 8 pages, I believe. And unlike other advisory circulars, which can get kind of long-winded and convoluted and kind of hard to follow, this one is actually written pretty well. And interesting enough, too, it was written before the iPad was even out there. I think it was released around 2007 or so. But it had the iPad's functionality in mind, again, whether it was a laptop or another tablet produced at that time. But a couple key points, and I do suggest getting online, if you haven't looked at this in a while, just to give it a quick read through to know what makes your operation legal and what the considerations are from the FAA standpoint. And first off, it considers the iPad or any electronic product that you as the pilot in command self-certify as a Class 1 electronic flight bag. Basically means you've taken a device off the shelf, bought it from a store, non-aviation product, and you are self-certifying it for the cockpit. 10 years later, we all know the iPad works great and is a great product for that. But of course, there's going to be new products in the future, new manufacturers. And if we decide to transition to that, again, that's your responsibility as the PIC to determine that it is a good product. States an obvious that it must have the functional equivalent of the paper reference material. And that's where our apps like ForeFlight or Garmin or WingX come into play. We could go onto the FAA's website if we wanted to and download all the charts ourselves and display them in a document reader. Of course, that's inconvenient, takes a lot of time and effort, so we pay a monthly or an annual subscription to these app developers to provide that data to us in a well-organized fashion. Very important point number 3 here is they say a backup source is recommended but not required. Again, that's up to you, what you feel most comfortable with. Some pilots fly just VFR and just take their iPad, and that's perfectly fine. Some pilots still feel comfortable having some backup paper charts, and that's perfectly fine too. It really just depends on what you're flying, how you're flying, and what your backups are in terms of reliability and how comfortable you feel with the product. And a lot of people consider just a second DFB. That could be a second iPad or an iPhone even with the apps installed. And then the final note here, there's no FAA approval required. So again, you're completely legal to purchase an iPad, install your aviation application, and go flying, whether it's VFR or IFR. So when the corporate aviation and airlines brought the iPad into the cockpit, most of them use Jeppesen as their primary aviation application. There was strict procedures in terms of the advisory circular, specified that they needed to develop standard operating procedures for how the iPad was going to be used. Just like everything in professional aviation, there's redundancies in terms of the crew, the aircraft systems, and then the supporting hardware and information, which is the iPad in this case. So there's things to consider from their standpoint in terms of the iPad pre-flight, making sure there's a data backup, making sure there's a power backup. We're now relying on a product that has a built-in internal battery. And then, of course, mounting. Most professional aircraft are going to have some kind of permanent mounting fixture to make sure the iPad is always accessible. As you look at this list, you're probably thinking, okay, yeah, these are good ideas for me too in my Cessna 172. And that's what we want to discuss here, how you can develop your own standard operating procedures to make sure the iPad is reliable for you on every flight. So first thing is obviously the data itself. And you can go into your app and select your states or your regions and download your charts. That's okay if you're just flying locally, but sometimes you're going on longer trips. You may not know what all the data is you need, and you want to verify that the data is indeed downloaded to your device. And there's some tricks here to help you with that. Here we're looking at ForeFlight. And on the left-hand side, we planned a flight here from Ohio out to the East Coast. And if you look right here on the left-hand screenshot, there's a little suitcase with a red little button. That's the pack button. If you press that, it'll bring up a window here that will analyze the flight and basically show you what charts are needed for that flight, or verify that you already have all the charts downloaded. So even if you go ahead and plan and download all the states you think you need, this is a good tip here to go in and check that each flight. It'll also download the weather onto your iPad's internal storage. So in the event you don't have in-flight weather, you'll have all that accessible stored without an internet connection. Number 2, on the right-hand side is a setting in ForeFlight. And for those not familiar, the More tab down here in ForeFlight at the bottom right, and then we're over here on the settings from the menu. There's a function here circled called automatic downloads. And what that will do is every 28 or 56 days, depending on the data, when you open ForeFlight up, it will automatically download the new chart updates. So if for some reason you're in a hurry or you have a flight pop up and you forget to download your charts, if you already have the states or regions selected, that automatic downloads feature can really cover you to make sure you have the data stored. But you as a pilot, just part of your pre-flight effort when you follow your flight plan, I think it's really smart just to use the pack feature also and just verify that everything is already stored for the planned route. Okay, so there's more than just backup of the data. We also or backup of the charts being downloaded, but you want to have a backup for the data also. And there's multiple ways to do that. Again, as I mentioned, it might be a second iPad if you really want to go the belts and suspenders method. Tricky part there is it's one more device to maintain. So one more battery to charge, one more device to keep data downloaded on. So it takes a little bit of discipline if you're going to go that route, but again, it gives you the extra reliability in the cockpit. You could also use your iPhone or your Android phone, whatever it might be, to download your EFB app and install the app on there and have your data as a backup. And you really think about it on a VFR or IFR flight, if you really did lose your iPad, you'd be able to pull up the key information, control tower frequencies, or even an approach chart. You'd be able to read that and make do just fine. And of course, paper is still an option. At Sporty's Pilot Shop, we still ship out lots of paper charts. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with going that route, whether it's instrument approach charts or a paper sectional. So next thing, as we've mentioned, the product is electronic, so it relies on an internal battery. And if you read or watch the Apple commercials, they'll show families on the couch watching 10 plus hours of video or surfing the internet. That's completely true. The thing is, as soon as you bring it in the cockpit and use it with a GPS source, it does require more computing power, more processor. So your battery life is really in the 4 to 6 hour range. And that's on a brand new iPad. So if your iPad's 2, 3, 4 years old, you might be in the 2 to 3 hour range. So that may not last you the entire flight, depending on what kind of flying you're doing. So because of that, there's some insurance options and some kind of backup things to think about in terms of what you can bring along to make sure that you always have power available. First off, let's start on the far right here for aircraft owners, which is a panel mount USB power solution. A couple options out there. This one here is the Stratus Power. Features two 2.1 amp USB ports. Garmin just released one of these as well. The same price point, around $300 to $350 that you can install on your panel also to supply 2 USB ports. Keep your phone charged, keep your Stratus charged, whatever it might be. At our avionics shop here in Cincinnati, we're seeing these almost become standard equipment just for every job that comes in because they're pretty easy to install and again guarantees that power for a fairly reasonable price. And these are TSO'd also for installation. Now, if you don't want to go that route, but you do have a cigarette lighter available in your cockpit, 12 to 24 volts or 28 volts with the charging system, you have this cigarette lighter adapter. And this is a really nice product. It has 2 USB ports, but it also gives you some electrical monitoring on your aircraft electrical system. So it's going to show you in real time what the voltage is of the system. If for some reason, let's say you're in a Cessna 172, a typical 28 volt system, if the power were to, or the volts were to drop down below 24.5, it'll actually give you a warning light and an audible tone. So it's kind of a nice backup too to let you know what's going on with the health of your electrical system if you don't already have a voltmeter or an amp meter. On the far left, this is really becoming the new most popular item because of how useful it is outside of aviation, and that's an iPad battery backup, which will allow you to plug your iPad in and really charge it multiple times. And there's 2 options now. We actually developed these at Sporty's for pilots with aviation in mind. It's our 5th generation probably battery pack that we've carried over the years, and this is finally the one that we designed ourselves after seeing what the needs were in aviation. But there's two models here. The big one on the left is 20,000 milliamp hours. And to put that in perspective, I think an iPad battery capacity is 7 to 9,000 milliamp hours, I believe, based on the model. So again, you can charge your iPad multiple times with this product. The big one has 3 USB-A ports, which is a standard USB port. Also has a USB-C port, so you can charge your Stratus or GoPro or whatever it might be. And then the right side is half the size, half the price. Also has USB-A and USB-C ports. Nice thing about both of these, though, is they're slim, which really makes a nice fit in aviation flight bags or a backpack. I take the big one with me in my backpack everywhere I go. So even when I'm not in the cockpit, it's great for keeping my cell phone charged when traveling by the airlines or just away from home for a while. But the best thing also is they can both be charged by a lightning cable. So you don't have to carry the proprietary or a proprietary charging cable, which is what we found was inconvenient over the years on a lot of battery backups. So great insurance here at a great price for those battery packs. We do have a special. This is through Sporty's. You can get that big battery pack, the cigarette lighter, and then a wall charger. All that for $99. So that really covers all your bases depending on how your aircraft's equipped, and provides a nice travel feature as well when outside the airplane. So when it comes to power, there are some things you can do on the software side if you're finding that your iPad battery is not lasting as long as it should, even maybe when you're not flying with it in the office or just using it recreationally. If you go into the main settings application, on the left-hand side over here, you'll see a battery option. And this will give you an analysis of what's been draining and what's been using your battery over both I believe it's a 24-hour period and up to 7 to 10 days as well. It's what you're going to find on here if your iPad is a couple years old. You might have a couple apps that are running in the background or using location services and really draining the battery for no good purpose. So you can turn those features off. Maybe you can delete the app if you don't even use it. But a great way to go in and look and see what's going on there. Now, the iPad's not perfect, and we hear from pilots probably the number one reason that your iPad would fail in flight is due to overheating. The lithium-ion battery inside the product is very heat sensitive, and there is a software built into the product to prevent it from overheating, so it'll actually shut it down if it gets too hot. And it's not always just ambient temperature either. It could be just sunlight hitting the screen or the dark screen in the cockpit. It might be nice and comfortable, but that screen acts like an absorber and just pulls all that heat in from the sunlight. And you'll go to look down and you'll see that temperature overheat. So if you are flying in those conditions or in a hot cockpit in Florida or Texas, there's a X-Knot cooling case, which is really nice and been really kind of a savior for a lot of pilots flying in those conditions, which has some cooling fans built into it. You can see the 4 here on the left side of the mount, which directs cool air around the iPad back of the case and back out again. It allows it to operate in those more extreme conditions. Runs on either AA batteries, or you can plug it into a USB port if you have that in your aircraft, or a backup battery as well, like we just showed. And I'll point out they just came out with an option for the iPad Pro 11-inch model. So if you have one of those newer, larger screen models, that'll fit that now as well. Another consideration, and this again comes from professional aviation, which are pretty much all the main corporate and airline aircraft are equipping now, is a fire containment bag. You'll hear about cases of a thermal runaway on the lithium-ion battery, and that gets really messy and really dangerous really fast because it's really difficult to stop that fire and the heat that comes from a lithium-ion battery fire. And so what has been developed are these containment bags that if that were to happen, they come with gloves usually and some tongs. You can put that device into the bag for storage until you can get on the ground quickly and dispose of the hazardous materials at that point. And when you're flying with these, depending on what kind of aircraft you are flying, think about not just your equipment, but what about your passengers? They probably have a tablet or a computer also. So it's cheap insurance to really mitigate that if it were to happen without having to open your window and throw it out or something else crazy that you might have to do to get by. Next up, as far as kind of the SOP processes, we don't want to put our iPad and just lay it on our lap without a case or without a cover, without a mount. It's a slippery product, and it's guaranteed to fall on the floor at the first sign of turbulence. So because of that, there's lots of different options from Sporty's, from RAM mounts, from my GoFlight, to either use a kneeboard type option, which is great for renter pilots or those that really like to have it on their knee if that works out in the aircraft. That's great for a Cirrus aircraft with a side stick or a diamond or larger cockpits. On the right-hand side is another fixture type, which is a yoke mount. That's the RAM mounting system. RAM makes a lot of configurable options for yoke mounting, for side windows with a suction cup, glare shield mounts, lots of different options there. And also, if you're interested in the RAM system, we do have a RAM builder on our website at sporties.com where you can enter in your iPad model and what you're looking to do, and it'll help assemble the different pieces. I think there's probably hundreds of different pieces that go together, but we have kits pre-assembled that can make that a lot easier for you to build your preferred system. I'll also point out there's a newer option from a company that's called Robust iPad Mounts. These start at just $29, so probably the most least costly method to mount your iPad. And what's nice about these is you don't buy a model for, say, iPad Air 10.5 or iPad Pro. They're flexible kits, so you just buy the kit and you basically assemble it to fit your iPad, which is nice. Is when you upgrade maybe a year or two from now to a slightly different model, you'll have all the pieces ready to go. So you don't have to buy a new cradle every time a new iPad comes out. They also have fixtures for your phone, which is also becoming a popular way to mount and use EFBs in the cockpit, which are the larger iPhones. The iPhone Maxes, for example, a lot of pilots like those to use in the cockpit instead of a full-size iPad. And lastly, stay organized. This is a tip I got from professional aviation, that as you start to go electronic, your flight bag gets a lot smaller, but you have a lot more important pieces. So you have your iPad, you have your knee board, you might have your backup battery, your charging cables. Start to look at some of the newer flight bag options to help keep all that organized. Instead of just using a big duffel bag where it's all dumped in there, have a place for each individual item, your headset, and also, for example, your backup radios. These flight bags were designed with pilots in mind and allow you to keep all your gear organized. On the left-hand side is the Sporty's Flight Gear iPad bag. That's my personal favorite. Again, we've developed these over the years, probably the fourth iteration of that product. And then another popular line of flight bags is those from Flight Outfitters, which have that signature orange coloring to them. And they also make a lot of great iPad accessories. So small bags that can hold all the gear you need and a nice carrying case. So let's move into actual operations using the iPad. And we're going to start with the pre-flight. When the iPad came out, initially we had a nice big moving map screen, which we could overlay weather, METARs, TAFs, radar. It got pilots thinking away from the DUAT system or calling flight service. We started to do our own weather briefings. We also transitioned away from paper charts to electronic charts. All the same data is built into these apps, but they might not be in the same places or the same flow that you were used to with paper. And that can lead a lot of new pilots, especially, to overlook some of the tried and true resources that we had available in paper format. And one example of that is the airport facility directory, or called the chart supplement now, which is the new FAA's term for it. But when you're going through your iPad, again, you may look at your sectional, you may look at your airport information, get the key frequencies, but you're only getting part of the information about that airport. And so I really encourage pilots before each flight to a new airport, and even check out your own airport if you haven't been into the AFD in a while. Go over here to the Airports tab on ForeFlight at the bottom left, and you'll find that AFD tab on the right-hand side there. And it's just a digital version of what you would find in the famous green book of all the information. Again, Garmin Pilot has something similar there in the airport information section. But you're going to find data in here that you're not going to find anywhere else. Things like runway slope, or how to activate the night's runway lights when you're flying at night, calm wind preferred runways, and nearby obstructions. So great resource to look at that, again, you may have overlooked just by going through your traditional maps and flight planning routine. And then when it comes to weather, again, I see this a lot with new pilots and in the training environment. It's very easy to go and pull up a METAR for your destination, a METAR for your departure airport, maybe look at the TAF, draw a line between the two airports, turn on the radar, looks clear, good to go, right? Well, not always. There's a lot more than just the basic routine weather reports and precipitation. And so what I want to encourage is to go beyond your routine, or possibly just that basic weather check, and maybe think outside a little bit of how you can expand that a little more. One way, which if you haven't done a full flight service weather briefing in a while, And I'm not saying call flight service by any means, but a lot of these apps have graphical flight service weather briefings built into them. So here's ForeFlight, for example. From the flight screen, when you go to file a flight plan, there will be a weather briefing option. If you tap on that, it brings up a whole new hidden section of the app that'll go through and give you that full briefing from start to finish, just like a brief would give you. So starting with inclement weather, weather hazards, running through the en route weather, terminal weather, etc. So great way to make sure you're checking off everything on the list that you should be looking at before a flight in terms of weather. Now, one nice feature that they keep doing is they keep adding, and this comes from Lido's flight service, they continue to add new weather charts. So here's one here, which I really like. It's the Aviation Clouds Forecast. And this is a new, relatively new feature that allows you to see forecast cloud bases and tops. So you can see here in the bottom left of the screen down towards, looks like we're in Western Tennessee. So it's overcast 4,000, tops at 7,000. Now it's a computer model, it's a forecast, but it gives you some clue if you're flying IFR, for example, where you might be on top of the clouds. Now what this is a snapshot from the graphical forecast for aviation. It's one of my favorite online products, so we're moving outside the iPad here for a minute. But if you go to aviationweather.gov, the main government and NOAA weather website, you'll find a graphical forecast for aviation product. And there you can go into an interactive cloud forecast and change the forecast times and all that. Point being here is that if you are using ForeFlight, some of that data is baked in if you use that graphical weather briefing. So check back to that from time to time because they continue to add new weather features in there. Again, getting beyond just the routine airmets, sigmets, etc. Another key point here, and again, we're in a different part of the app now. We're back over on the airports tab, and we're on the weather section of the airports tab. And you see your standard METAR, your TAF, your MOS, but you have this forecast discussion. Another key feature that ForeFlight, Garmin Pilot does this too, that they bring into the app to give you a little more insight about the weather. And what the forecast discussion is a written kind of journal almost by the meteorologist that put out the TAFs. Gives you information about what they were thinking about when they wrote the TAF. So a TAF is limited to a very small amount of symbols and lines. This allows them to go into more detail and give you confidence levels. So when you see, say, showers in the vicinity, VCSH, might tell you that, hey, it's forecast on the northwest side of the airport, but if you're flying south of there, it's fine. It's going to give you a little more regional context of what's going on. So every time I look at a TAF here in ForeFlight, I always make sure to come down to the forecast discussion and check that out also. So this time of year, we're starting to get into the icing season. As the weather turns colder, it's a big concern for pilots, of course, flying with aircraft that are not known or not capable of flying into known icing. And there's a couple of different resources here in ForeFlight I want to point out, and some takeaways from them as well to know what you're looking at. So here we are, where we have the ForeFlight layer dropdown. We have the icing layer enabled, and we have a time slider. So this is a forecast. This is a computer-generated product. It's not done by a meteorologist, but it's computer-generated based on forecast models. You have time, and you have a slider here on the right-hand side for altitude. Now, it's very important to know what you're looking at here because there's lots of different icing forecast products. And in ForeFlight, what we're looking at is a icing severity product. So it's telling you how long it's going to take for a 1/4 inch of ice to develop on your aircraft. Obviously, the darker colors means the more likely and less time it's going to take. So we're looking at severity, not probability. I bring that up because if you're a Garmin Pilot user, here we have the icing layer turned on. Here we're looking at probability. So that means what are the likely chances that ice is going to come out in this airspace that I'm flying in at this altitude. To me, a high probability of very light icing is a lot different than a, say, medium probability or low probability of severe icing. Two different things, right? But if the icing is there and it's severe, I'm staying far, far away from it. But high probability of very, very light icing with the proper aircraft equipment is a whole different story. So make sure you know what you're looking at because not all icing forecasts are created equal. Again, just to recap back on the ForeFlight, this is a forecast of severity. And it brings up a good point. If you ever are confused about what you're looking at in the app, in ForeFlight, for example, I don't have a slide on it here, but there's a document section. They've got a great pilot's guide in there with several hundred pages of content to review. So check that out if you are looking at a weather layer or a feature and you want to know a little bit more about it. The pilot's guide is a great tool for that. One other section related to icing before we move on from weather is the imagery section. I know a lot of pilots just kind of skip over that or glance beyond it because it looks like a lot of complicated meteorology charts, but they really are designed for pilots, and there's a lot of great information here. Again, when it comes to icing, this is all data pulled from the aviationweather.gov forecast. But again, you can look at different severity forecasts. They also have probability analysis, freezing level. Again, a lot of great resources here based on what your kind of flying needs are and what altitude you'll be flying at. Now, for VFR pilots, when it comes time to plan a flight on a nice day, weather's good, no clouds in sight, now we got to think about airspace. And the ForeFlight and Garmin Pilot can do a lot here to help you plan ahead, moving away from sectionals, but doing some kind of graphical analysis of your flight to see what airspace you might be flying in. So the way to do this is to go ahead and enter your flight plan here. Looks like we're going from Tampa over to Titusville. We have the destination and departure airports entered. In that case, but we're going to show a different example. Looks like we're going south now, but it'll show you an analysis if you click on the profile tab of the airspace that you'll be transgressing through. So here we are, we have a slider at 10,500 feet. You can see that puts us over this blue area, which is a section of Class B airspace. But you can see at that altitude, it's going to take us through some restricted areas and some MOAs. So it's a way to evaluate your flight plan with a cross section. It'll actually highlight those too on the map here. So I highly recommend anytime you're flying VFR and you want to do a quick analysis to, again, to see if there's any special use airspace or just determine the altitudes visually on a profile view of Class B, Class C, or Class D airspace, a great tool. And you can slide this up and down to see how it affects and what airspace it'll interact with, as well as any terrain or obstacles along the ground. As you can see there, we're in Florida, pretty flat land, but there's probably some towers or other buildings and things along the way. That's what we're looking at there at the bottom. It's a great tool for VFR pilots when flying near busy airspace. And here's how Garmin presents that as well. Here we're looking at more of a terrain obstruction along that route at that altitude. And looks like we have the Class B airspace of Charlotte depicted here to show what that looks like. Another gotcha is TFRs, especially as we get near the election season next year. There's going to be a lot of presidential TFRs and VIP travel temporary flight restrictions. So my standard protocol is to always leave the TFR layer enabled on my aviation application. It can't hurt. They don't take up a lot of space in terms of obstructing the view, but it's always going to make them in your kind of peripheral as you're going through in pre-flight planning in the flight and staying aware of what's going on. A nice feature now that all these apps include are stadium TFRs. These fall under that blanket NOTAM that basically says when any sporting event, Major League Baseball, NFL, anything with the seating capacity of 30,000 people or greater, there's a temporary flight restriction. I think it's around 3 miles around the stadium up to a couple thousand feet. But this is going to actually point them out on the map for you, which is very helpful when flying in new cities where you may not know where the racetracks are, the NCAA football stadiums, whatever it might be. So again, by leaving that TFR layer always enabled, it's going to help call out this temporary flight restrictions as your pre-flight planning on the map. This next one's a relatively new feature. This has to do with AOPA's efforts to make FBO fees more transparent. And I want to say about a year to 9 months ago, AOPA started publishing FBO fees. So you could see when you went to different FBOs, what their hangar fees are, what their overnight fees are, what the ramp fee, the various options. And AOPA is making that data accessible. So here we are in both Garmin Pilot on the left and ForeFlight on the right, seeing those fees out there. So you can start to compare FBOs and even airports when you're planning a trip. On the Garmin side here, we're in the airport section, and you'll find the FBO tab here on the left-hand side. And on ForeFlight, you can see that we have on the airport page pulled up an FBO and then looked at the fees section here. And I think more and more, due to AOPA's efforts, we're going to see more information about this, which could save you some time and not have to call every FBO to kind of figure out what the basic fees are and help you make a more informed decision when planning a flight to a new airport or a new city. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, or hopefully you're aware, back in August, the FAA transitioned to the ICAO flight plan format, making that required for all VFR and IFR flight plans filed in the US. Even if you're not leaving the US, we have to use this ICAO flight plan format now. This is a great example here if it's new to you or you want a little bit more information to go check out iPad Pilot News and just search for ICAO. And we just wrote an in-depth article about a month or two ago on how to set up your aircraft because there are additional details required to set up your airplane and send that data through with the flight plan. Now, on a big picture view, once you get your aircraft entered and you tell the system what kind of GPS receiver you have, what kind of ADS-B receiver or transponder you have, you do that once. Filing the flight plan is actually just like the domestic flight plan. There's not really anything different about it. Just have to make sure that on the form type here, as you can see, we have in the ForeFlight screenshot, that you select the ICAO option to make sure that's transmitted through flight service in that format. Otherwise, pretty simple to do going forward. Only other difference is you'll have to specify your backup, or not backup, but life-saving equipment, things like rafts or life vests that you have on board, any backup radios. But otherwise, the flight plan is filed the exact same way. So really not a big deal once you have your airplane all configured. So let's get to the more exciting part now, which is the iPad as your digital co-pilot. And this is where we can take the iPad, kind of thinking back to 2010 when it was a digital chart viewer, more of a passive product. It allowed us to view our sectionals and charts in electronic format, which is great. That's why we all went to the product and transitioned away from paper charts. But here in 2019, almost a decade later, there's so much more we can do with it now. But you have to do some configuration. You have to be aware of these features and set them up properly so that when, again, the workload's tougher and things are moving quickly, that all the things are there ready for you and set, just like a co-pilot would be. You have to plan ahead with that. So what's a co-pilot do? Kind of in a nutshell, comparing the person sitting in the right seat to what your iPad is. Provides timely information before and during a flight, calls out abnormalities or flight deviations, assists with duties during high workload phases of flight, and of course, makes strong coffee. And whenever I'm the co-pilot, that's always my job, so I've got that down pat. iPad's not going to help you there, but we'll show you how it can do everything else. So let's start on the ground first when we're planning a flight, because there's a lot of things that the iPad can do now to take all the information that's available in electronic form, FAA data feeds, etc., that can help you make smarter decisions during the pre-flight planning process. Now, the first one here is one of my favorites. That is the ATC cleared routing. This is for IFR pilots looking to file a flight plan. Very helpful when you're flying between two airports that you haven't been to before. What you can do is after you enter those flight plan airports, here we're going from Cincinnati to Atlanta on both Garmin and ForeFlight. On Garmin here, you select the routing option. And on ForeFlight, there's a routes button that will bring this up. It's going to show you recently cleared flights between those airports. So actual flights in aircraft similar to yours, you can see them based on whether it's a jet or a piston aircraft flying at 10,000 feet. But it's going to show you the most common routes filed and cleared by ATC. Makes it much easier to determine what's best. You can go ahead and plan for it, review it on the ground, the comfort of your home. Go ahead and enter it into your ForeFlight, have it ready, have it briefed, and then go ahead and file it. Then when you call clearance delivery, you're pretty much guaranteed that they're going to say cleared as filed. Makes it a lot easier at that point to go ahead and load it into your GPS navigator. No surprises, go on your way. So highly recommend for IFR pilots to always check planned ATC routing. It'll give you a great clue as to what to file for those new airports. Next up has to do with NOTAMs. And NOTAMs tend to be a sore spot with pilots, really prior to the iPad because they were so difficult to find. They were buried at the end of a weather briefing in a bunch of paper and text that was sometimes indecipherable and made it very easy to miss closed airports, closed runways, etc. So what ForeFlight's done, and this is great, and this has been in the app for many years now, is they put the NOTAMs for the airport right on the airport diagram in a big red box on a place that you're probably not going to miss. Just tap that red NOTAM button there. They're also on the approach charts, so any NOTAMs related to approach minimum changes or procedural changes will show up right on the approach chart, again making it nearly impossible for you to miss, provided you actually are looking at the chart. The next feature they added, I think it was earlier this year, has to do with closed runways or closed airports. Again, trying to get that in your face and make it right in front of you, so that as long as you are checking the airport, either the page itself in ForeFlight or if you tap on the airport on the maps, you're going to see closed runways, that big red label, like here on the left-hand side for a couple closed runways. And then on the right-hand side here, again, you can see in Minneapolis, a couple closed runways due to, I think it was a snowstorm that came through the area. But it's going to eliminate that situation on a nice VFR day when you're going out for breakfast to the airport diner, maybe 50 to 100 miles away, and find out that they're doing airport runway paving over the Unicom when you come in for landing. So a very simple method to go in and check your NOTAMs, the key NOTAMs before flight, really just passively by being in the app altogether. Now for IFR pilots, we're required to file an alternate when the weather is going to be low at or near the destination. And now ForeFlight, what they'll do, here we are in the flights section of the app, the place where you'll enter in all your flight details and file your flight plan. They have an alternate advisor feature now. So it's going to analyze your flight and suggest other airports nearby with color coding for the for the forecast weather when you'd be getting there, as well as what approaches they have available, and then your fuel burn and time to get to that alternate airport based on the distance from your destination airport. So another really nice contextual feature to keep you apprised of what's going on and save you time when it comes time to plan the alternate for your IFR flight. ForeFlight added this feature earlier this year. It's a takeoff and landing performance capability. I believe this requires one of the more advanced subscriptions, but can save you a lot of time again and really save you when it comes time to performance calculations. And what it'll do is it'll use the current weather and all the performance profile data for your aircraft that's included with the app for a majority of general aviation aircraft, and will calculate automatically your takeoff distances and your climb speeds and your rotation speeds. So everything's right there done automatically for you to verify that based on the conditions that you and the runway length, you have the performance necessary to get off the ground. And what's nice here is that if there is an issue, say at a short runway, or if the conditions of the day dictated otherwise, it's going to give you warnings if your performance of the aircraft does not match the available runway or the selected runway for takeoff or landing. So again, it's checking your performance even before you even do anything, just by having the data entered in for your flight plan. It's another great check that the app can do automatically, maybe prevent you from getting into a bad situation. Another tool here for IFR pilots is the pre-departure clearance system. It's available at 70 airports across the United States, mainly the airline-served airports at Class B airports. But this program allows you to receive an IFR clearance via text message and email right through ForeFlight. And this is not a ForeFlight specific feature. It's an FAA service that requires a third-party provider. Flightplan.com does this. ForeFlight does it. Garmin Pilot does it. A great tool for those that are flying at the busier airports to save the hassle of calling clearance delivery. So again, looking for more information on this, check out iPad Pilot News. We have a full kind of how-to article of how that works. But a nice feature for those, again, flying at the busier airports. ForeFlight is also publishing the digital ATIS in the weather section. So if you're, again, taking off from one of the busier airports that publishes a digital ATIS, typically the Class B or C airports, you can go ahead and check that ahead of time and see what runways are in use, any taxiway closures, etc. But a great way to review that information so that you're not calling up ATIS for the first time when you fire up your airplane with the engine running. It allows you to be, again, like the IFR routing, ATC cleared routing options, to be more prepared when you get into the cockpit and the engine's fired up by knowing all this information and not waiting to call up on the different frequencies to get that in the airplane. Now here's one I mentioned before. There's some things you want to do ahead of time. And if you haven't done this yet in ForeFlight, I highly recommend it, which is the Glide Advisor. And what this will do is if you turn the layer on, we'll show you a teal, basically a ring or a path around your aircraft that shows, based if you were to fly at the best glide speed, based on your preset glide ratio, how far you could glide in an engine out emergency. And the reason I say it's important to come in ahead of time, because if you go here to settings in ForeFlight, the little gear drop down on the maps page, come down to glide settings, make sure to go ahead and enter in for the aircraft you are flying the best glide speed and the glide ratio, 9 or 10 to 1 or so for GA piston aircraft. That way, if you do have an emergency, you can tap on that Glide Advisor setting here, or some pilots prefer to just leave it on all the time, just always have that available. Could really save your butt if something were to happen and you had to make a off-field landing without much time to prepare and maybe determine quickly based on winds aloft. If you're flying with an ADS-B weather receiver, it will update the winds and show you the best path to an emergency airport. Another one in ForeFlight, they have the digital checklists, and some pilots prefer to stay have the paper checklist, which is me. But if you do, even if you do have the paper checklist, I would recommend still setting up your aircraft in here with the electronic for one reason, which is to take use of the emergency option. So you can come right in here to more checklist and tap that red button at the top right up there. That's a quick access to the emergency checklist available for your aircraft. So maybe your emergency checklist is in the back seat behind you, or you need something really fast, but you already have your iPad on your kneeboard. Could be a quick way to check out that checklist procedure and make it a little bit easier for you. In the previous slide here, they also have a speak option, which allows you to have the checklist spoken to you. So if you have your iPad connected to your headset, either through Bluetooth or an audio cable, you can use the audio checklist function and tap through the app and have the audio checklist read to you in the airplane. So another feature when deciding a takeoff runway or coming in for landing, and again, this data here is fed through both the internet and through ADS-B or SiriusXM, is a runway analysis based on the current winds. So it's going to tell you what the optimum runway is for the most headwind component. In this case, runway 22 has a 8 to 10 knot headwind with a 12 to 16 knot crosswind. So not only is it going to help you evaluate the best runway, but also verify that you're within your crosswind component recommended for the airplane as well. So much more convenient, obviously, for aircraft or airports that have multiple runways at a non-towered airport to determine what the best solution is. But again, it's kind of thinking ahead for you and giving you information to help you make the best decision from your device. So if you do nothing else today, I think if you have one takeaway, which there's a lot of takeaways here from this presentation, I'd recommend getting into your app and in ForeFlight in this example and check out all the different settings. For better or worse, ForeFlight probably has 70 or 80 different settings and customizable layers and alerts. Go in and spend some time and look through all those, because you're probably going to find some things you didn't even know existed that are available, which I'm going to cover here in just a minute. But you'll find it more helpful at your own time to read through those. And again, if you find something you don't understand or don't know what it is, that's a great time to pull up the ForeFlight's Pilot's Guide or your app's Pilot's Guide and read through it to determine more about what that'll do. And before I go further, again, I mentioned having your headset connected to your iPad. If you have a newer Bose or a Lightspeed or David Clark that has the Bluetooth capability, a great idea is to go ahead and pair your iPad's Bluetooth connection to your headset. And that way you're going to get these alerts that we're going to talk about right into your headset. You might still hear them over your iPad's speaker if you turn it really up, really loud. But the best way is to have it broadcast right through your headset. So if you get a traffic alert or a runway crossing alert, whatever it might be, it's going to go ahead and display both on the screen and give you that audio alert in your headset, which is very helpful because you're not always staring at the iPad. So it's going to get your attention in those critical times while still keeping your head looking outside the window. So let's run through a couple alerts here just to give you a feel for what's available in the app, and again, things that can help you stay more aware of what's going on and catch you if you're in a difficult situation. So here are some flight contextual alerts, helpful callouts along the way. On the left-hand side, we have the nearest altimeter setting. If you're flying in the flight levels, as you descend below flight level 180 and near that altitude, it's going to give you the nearest altimeter setting as you transition from 2992. In the middle part here, it's going to give you the local arrival airport weather frequency, whether it's an AWOS or ATIS. It'll usually give it to you in range when you're 20, 30 minutes out or so. On the far right is a final approach runway reminder. Make sure you're lined up with the correct runway. A nice helpful call out there. Same thing that a co-pilot would probably give you if you're flying with a second pilot. Next batch here, a little bit more important, time-sensitive warnings. So traffic alerts if you're flying with an ADS-B traffic receiver. TFR is obviously very important. You want to be aware of those if for some reason you missed it. And what's nice about the TFR alert is it'll show up even if you don't have the TFR layer enabled. So you might be flying along, not paying attention, but you're getting near Washington, D.C. or presidential TFR. It's going to call that out with both an audio and a visual alert to get your attention to turn around or make sure you know what you're doing. And then a kind of a standard item now that we've had for many years on portable GPS receivers, which is that obstacle and terrain alert. Very helpful in mountainous terrain and those flying low altitudes, especially in helicopters or smaller aircraft, just for sightseeing purposes. As you enter the runway, it's going to give you a warning about which runway you're entering, as well as how many feet are remaining. So very helpful if you're doing an intersection takeoff. And if nothing else, just to verify, say on an IFR day, that you are indeed on the correct runway and that your performance matches up with the amount of runway available for that airport. And then after landing, a nice feature all these apps have now is that they will automatically show the taxiway diagram after landing. So as you decelerate on the runway, say below 30 knots or so, as you roll off the taxiway, you're going to look down on your iPad and automatically see the airport diagram there. So it saves you the heads down time of having to tap around different buttons and find the airport diagram. So that way you can go ahead and call ground and have your information in front of you as they give you a ground clearance. Last item I want to point out, kind of related to making your pre-flight processes easier. For those that fly outside the United States, there is the customs notification process to alert them of your passengers whenever flying across the US, outside of the US, or coming back into the US. Most commonly, say for Canada flying, or Mexico, or down to the Caribbean. And I want to point out an app here called FlashPass, which allows you to file that EAPIS manifest right from your iPad. Costs less than $10, I believe, per manifest, but really makes it easy to save all the passenger data, passport information. And this year they also added Canadian and Bahamas customs paperwork processing, as well as the CARICOM requirement for those flying down further into the Caribbean. Many of the islands there have a EAPIS notification requirement as well, and you can use FlashPass for that. Okay, we're getting towards 9 o'clock. I have a little bit more left here. If you bear with me here, we're going to cover data link weather briefly. And as far as weather goes, I want to point out we have 2 other recordings of webinars we did earlier this year. I did a presentation with Scott Dimmick, a meteorologist with a specialty in aviation, on really just weather and flying with the iPad and using the iPad for pre-flight weather. Again, that's on our Sporty's YouTube channel. And then my colleague, John Zimmerman, did a full presentation on flying with data link weather with ADS-B and SiriusXM. So those are both separate full hour presentations I'd like to recommend if you're looking to get some more information about weather. But let's talk about how it relates to the iPad briefly and what you can add as accessory-wise to the iPad to give you some additional information. So before the iPad, we really just had Flight Watch or Flight Service or ATC guidance to give us information about convective weather, destination weather when it was further than we could pick up on our radio. Those features are pretty much going away. Now it's more of a self-service feature. So we, the pilots, have way more information now in terms of where the thunderstorms are, where the icing conditions are, and destination weather. And that's a good thing, but you have to be properly equipped with the right equipment to be able to pick up that information and display it in the cockpit. So the common acronym you're hearing, especially now as we approach year 2020, is ADS-B. And there's 2 components of it. On the left-hand side is the panel mount transponder. That is a certified piece of equipment installed in your panel by a mechanic, an avionics specialist. It's a $3,000 to $4,000 product. That's what you need to fly in busier airspace by the year 2020. On the right-hand side is the much less expensive, more affordable option, which is the ADS-B in receiver. It does not allow us to fly in the 2020 airspace requirement, but it provides us with the benefit of data link weather and traffic in the cockpit. And the way that works is there are ground stations across the US, about 620 of them, probably a couple more now. And those are constantly broadcasting a feed of this weather data up into the air. And those are also the towers that receive the broadcast from aircraft in flight that allows air traffic control to know exactly where everybody is as part of the future air traffic control, the next generation air traffic control system. What we can do as iPad pilots, regardless of how your panel's equipped, is take that feed with a portable receiver, such as Stratus 3 that we're showing here. It'll pick up that information and wirelessly broadcast it to your iPad in the cockpit. It allows you to see the radar, the METARs and TAFs, etc. And these boxes are pretty common now. A lot of these are on the 3rd and 4th generation as well, given that ADS-B weather's been out for probably about 6-7 years now. But the nice thing is they also pick up traffic. So you're going to see nearby traffic, the aircraft that also have ADS-B out transponders. It's going to solve the GPS requirement. So it's going to supply GPS data to your iPad. So you don't have to buy the model with GPS or add a GPS receiver. Most of these are self-sufficient. So they have an internal battery. They're going to use either Wi-Fi or Bluetooth to connect to your iPad. And the higher end models also have AHRS. So they're going to drive your pitch and bank display on your iPad's synthetic vision so that you have backup pitch and bank information. Most common options here are the Stratus for ForeFlight, the GDL50 from Garmin, which works with ForeFlight and Garmin, and the Sentry option, which is ForeFlight's branded ADS-B receiver. I'll point out that ForeFlight did release the Sentry Mini earlier this year. the lowest cost option yet for adding ADS-B weather, GPS, and traffic to ForeFlight. Downside is, or the limitation, there's no battery, so it does require a USB power source, whether that's coming from your panel, maybe one of the flight gear battery packs we talked about earlier. But for $299, it's a great value to get in to start using ADS-B with your iPad in the cockpit. Stratus 3, and the Stratus name has been around, really was one of the first ADS-B products out there. I will point out Stratus 3 now does work with all the apps that support ADS-B, so it would be on ForeFlight. I work with WingX Pro, Flight Plan Go, Arovi, FlyQ, and a couple others. So probably the most compatible device that works with ForeFlight and your other aviation applications. Won't spend much time on this, but Garmin does offer a SiriusXM satellite weather receiver. It's a combination of either the GDL51, which is a dedicated SiriusXM receiver, or the GDL52, which has both SiriusXM and ADS-B if you want it all. These products also include GPS, rechargeable battery, provide some additional weather options that are part of SiriusXM, but it does require that SiriusXM monthly subscription of around $39.99. It also has the option to broadcast satellite radio for the satellite feed, so you have satellite radio through your application in the cockpit. And I do want to point out, because there's a lot of confusion here, that ForeFlight does support all the GDL products. So if you want to go the Garmin route, whether it's the GDL 50, 51, or 52, they all do also work with both ForeFlight and the Garmin Pilot application. So why might you want SiriusXM? A couple of reasons. If you fly into southern Canada, just north of the US border, a little further away than the ADS-B coverage, you will get some coverage there for pilots in that region. There's a higher resolution radar imagery for the entire US, so if you have a storm system you're tracking more than 250 nautical miles away, you're going to get a much higher resolution picture of that, along with echo tops, lightning, and storm cell tracks. If you're flying down the Bahamas, you're going to get better coverage there with SiriusXM. As I mentioned, of course, the XM radio feature. Last but not least, there are some new weather products for those flying with the ADS-B weather system. These came out last year, so this is kind of a version 2 of the aviation ADS-B weather products. This is the ForeFlight layer list here, but you can see cloud tops, forecast cloud tops, I should say, forecast turbulence, center weather advisories, and observed lightning strikes. And there's a quick view of what those look like in ForeFlight. A lot of these things are better pre-flight planning products, but I have found the lightning is nice because it updates every 5 minutes. It's a much faster update rate than the actual radar imagery itself, so it allows you to track the development of systems. You're still not going to use it to fly very close to a storm system, but it allows you to keep an eye on how quickly it's developing and whether it's growing or dying out. Okay, with that, I'm going to wrap up, turn it back over to Eric. Thanks for bearing with me for the extra 5 minutes. Again, check out iPad Pilot News for more information here, and you'll be getting an email tomorrow with links to articles covering all the topics we discussed this evening.
Excellent. Thanks for a great presentation. Reminder to all, our presentation was recorded. It will be available sportys.com/webinars, as well as the Sporty's YouTube channel as early as tomorrow. Don't forget to check out iPadPilotNews.com. Make sure you are a subscriber. We certainly appreciate you joining us. Appreciate you considering Sportys.com for all your future training and pilot supply needs. And we certainly hope to have you back in the very near future for another presentation. Always view our complete schedule at sportys.com/webinars. For Bret Koebbe, I'm Eric Radke, wishing you all a very good evening and safe flying. Thank you.